My name is Alice Knapp. I'm the president of the Ferguson Library, and I'm very excited tonight because this is yet another session in CrimeCONN Express. Um, it is a wonderful partnership between the Mystery Writers of America, New York chapter, and the Ferguson Library. Normally we get to do this in person, but the beauty of doing it by Zoom is that we get to invite people who we never see on the East Coast. I wanted to say that this program is underwritten by the Friends of the Ferguson Library. For those of you who aren't from Stanford, I'll let you know that they are the secret sauce that make the Ferguson Library great and brings to you programs such as this. We couldn't do it without them. We run a used bookshop, and that's how we underwrite most of our programs. So please, if you're in the Stanford area, stop by and visit. If you are interested in any of the authors tonight, please go to Elm Street Books in New Canaan. They have been our partners for most of our author programs, and it's always good to support an independent bookstore. We couldn't do this without our Mystery Writers of America, and I want to introduce to you Connecticut writer Tom Straw. He is an Emmy-nominated TV producer and author of 7 New York Times bestsellers under the pen name Richard Castle. And if you like, you can get those as either ebooks or physical books from the Ferguson Library. He still writes and produces TV, most recently Showtime's Nurse Jackie, and is also a director on the national board of the Mystery Writers of America. Tom, it is so good to see you.
Thank you, Alice, and everyone at the Ferguson Library in Stanford. You know, for years, the Ferguson Library has been a terrific venue for CrimeConn's annual in-person panels. And now they've topped themselves by setting it up so the Mystery Writers of America New York, Connecticut chapter can go virtual. Case in point, I am not the actual Tom Straw. I am the virtual one. Just as easy on the eyes, but now you can mute me. Tonight's panel makes an easy segue to that theme. It's entitled How to Connect in a Time of Disconnection. Clever communicators turn the virtual into reality. This is a Zoom so big that we needed 2 moderators. One of them is Charles Salzberg. Charles is a former magazine journalist and nonfiction book writer, but Charles is also a 2-time Shamus Award nominee for his novels Swan's Last Song and Second Story Man, which also won the Beverly Hills Book Award. John B. Valeri is a lifelong lover of crime fiction whose affinity for law and disorder has thus far been contained to the page. John's work has appeared online and in print, and he often interrogates authors and other industry insiders on his YouTube show, Central Booking. Let's start by giving a virtual hand to John Valeri.
Thank you, Tom. So I am really excited tonight because we are going all the way out to the West Coast. All eyes on Arizona again, but tonight for the legendary Barbara Peters, who began her career in the Library of Congress and also the law, but then decided to move to Arizona. And in 1989, she opened the Poison Pen bookstore. So that was some 31 years ago, which is pretty incredible. But in addition to that, she co-founded the Poison Pen Press in 1997 with her husband, and that is now the mystery imprint of Source Books. And just to give you an idea of her stature in the community, Barbara has been nominated for the Edgar Allan Poe Award. She's won the Mystery Writers of America Award for bookselling. She's won, that was the Raven Award. She's won the Ellery Queen Award for editing. She has 12 times been nominated for the Bookseller of the Year, and in 2011 received the Lifetime Achievement Award, the $1 Million Club from the Arizona Republic. And that was 9 years ago, and here you are still doing incredible things. So welcome, Barbara. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. The bravest thing about me is that I'm putting my 80-year-old face out here in front of a camera because I started the Poison Pen on my 50th birthday.
Oh my gosh, nobody would ever believe that.
Well, I didn't say it for praise. I just in fact.
Well, that's terrific. And so I figured, before we jump into the business of connecting in socially distant times, I did want to ask you, what first inspired you to open a bookstore? Because it was a bit different than what you were doing. And how has your mission evolved throughout the years, if at all? Or is it the same now as it was then?
No, it can't be the same now. I should say that the Poison Pen is a not-for-profit bookstore. It began because my husband, whom I also married on my 50th birthday, said to me, now that you can do whatever you want, what is it you're going to do? Which was a wonderful statement. And I said, I really miss the library. I really miss books. And he said, we're not moving back to Washington, so you can rejoin the Library of Congress. And I said, great, then I'll have a bookstore. And he said, okay. And together, we actually put it together. But I do think the fact, I didn't want anyone to think that because this is for fun for me and not for profit, that I don't take it really seriously. And now I have like 20 people on staff, so I have to take it really seriously. It's a mom thing at this stage.
Absolutely. And so I did want to ask you, and we were actually speaking briefly to this before we started live tonight, but you were telling me, if my memory serves, from 10 minutes ago, that you were doing your first virtual events in 1995. And virtual really has now not only become the norm, but it's become a necessity. So can you talk about what compelled you to first sort of broach the virtual world, and how that's sort of helped you to prepare for the unique considerations that we're all going through during this pandemic?
We were asked to host Left Coast Crime the first time it moved out of California. And we were really fortunate that it turned out that Robert Parker and Tony Hillerman and P.D. James were all our guests of honor. And when P.D. James arrived on a terrible rainy day, there was room for 300 people in the venue and 600 people showed up. And in a panic, I said to the city of Scottsdale, whose facility we were in, and they had a little TV station, and I ran upstairs and I said, is there any way that you could come down here and turn this into television for people who are trapped out in the lobby? Because there were a couple of monitors out there. And they thought about it and they said, okay, but our price will be that we get to show the video as part of our programming for the library. Well, it turned out that P.D. James, who was still in her rain suit and hated every minute of the whole thing, said to me, and I had drafted up an affidavit in the back room of the bookstore, that we would never show it in her lifetime. But it was, and we haven't, but it inspired the library to ask us to do author interviews. And it was wonderful. And we had our own little station. I still remember getting up in one morning at 5 o'clock to watch Dave Barry on Good Morning America or whatever, the Today Show, and terrifying myself. And then Dave Barry arrived and we sat down in front of the camera of the little Scottsdale library. And I said, Dave, I got up at 5 o'clock this morning and terrified myself by watching you on TV. And he said to me, and this is something I think everyone should remember, he said to me, but that was all about them. He said, this is going to be all about me, right? And from that, I recognized that that really is the point. The point is that you want to make it all about the author and the author's work. You want to showcase them. And we never looked back. When the TV station kind of died out, we just thought, okay, we'll move it over to the bookstore. So we have videoed all of our in-store events since like 2001. They're all over. We were on live stream. Now they're all on Facebook. We have our own YouTube channel and we make podcasts. So we have like 50,000 downloads since June of podcasts that we have done from our events, but they all still rotate around the point of giving the author as much visibility as possible.
Sure. And I have to say, I love that. I've attended a lot of your events and I always feel very fortunate that we can do that because, as a big mystery writer and reader, more reader than writer, I get a little jealous when I see these amazing authors that you have, and they don't always find their way to Connecticut, but it's amazing to be able to, in real time or in playback, watch an event at your store, order a signed book. So I thank you because it's made my life, it's been enriching. And you said you like to keep the focus on the author, and anybody who has seen your events knows that they are the star of the show. But I did want to ask you too, you make a nice experience for your participants, and especially now, people who have to watch through computers. And I was wondering if you can tell me what it is that you think makes for a good experience that translates to your participants and how you and your staff are still able to engage them despite the fact that we're separated by screens.
I think it has to be natural. There are always things that go wrong. Tech is never perfect. We have had authors whose screens have frozen. We've had tech issues of our own. I had to do Michael Connolly at home the other night because we had a major problem here at the store where I currently am. And I had to throw up a green screen because my office is a disaster. So, I have a fake, the whole fake thing. And the dog on the couch never barked because she's a photograph. And that turned out to be the focus of the 6,000 people watching Michael Connolly Tuesday night is, when is the dog going to bark? But my point is that you have to embrace all that. You have to, laugh your way through it. You have to, make it funny if you can. If things go wrong, you have to be natural. It helps that I was a trial lawyer for, a long time. And so you don't want to grill people, but you do have to, when you do an interview, you have to drill down to what are the major questions that the audience is likely to have. For example, everybody wants to know if there's going to be a TV show. So it's way better for me to ask the author than to have, a zillion comments go by on Facebook. You try to anticipate what that will be. Most of the authors that we talk to, I have been interviewing them for forever, their entire careers. C.J. Box, Craig Johnson, Michael Connolly, you name it. 31 years, we've had a chance to do every book with them. So there's no real preparation involved, and we're all used to each other. For new authors, I think it's a much harder bar. Our experience is, and I'm sad to say this, that it's virtually impossible to monetize a paperback event. With no people in the store, very limited shopping by appointment, you don't have people browsing and picking up things. So we are increasingly having to say that we have to focus on the events we can monetize. Otherwise, it's a waste of resources. But what can work, and for those of you who are worried about this, is that if you get a group together, for example, Kensington, we're doing a group of 5 Kensington authors. I'm increasingly adding in other authors. I just dropped Lisa Gardner a note and said, since she told me you've already read the Baldacci, do you want to pop in at 8:30 and talk to David with me when we launch him on Tuesday? If you can make it more interesting by additional, it can be showing a video. My favorite event we did this year was a guy who wrote a book about the Blakiston owl, which only lives in eastern Siberia. And my whole staff said to me, why do you want to talk to the owl guy? It's not going to do any good for any of us. And I said, because it'll really be fun. He had a fabulous slideshow, and he turned out to be nominated for the National Book Award. And when everybody said, so you have to take chances, I think, as a bookstore. You can't just do the obvious. And that's, I think, where for aspiring writers, this is a strength for you. I really developed a mission in, I think it was 1990 or 91, right after we opened. The American Bookseller Association asked me to chair the Mystery Booksellers Roundtable. And I think it might have been Pasadena or somewhere. Anyway, so I agreed to. And I'm sitting there, brand new, hardly know a thing, and have no particular plan. And the whole subject of the conversation in this roundtable was how unfair it was that publishers were giving Barnes & Noble a huge discount for the upcoming John Grisham. And these people felt that it would impede them from selling any copies of John Grisham because they couldn't compete in price. And I listened to that for a little bit, and I looked at them and I said, why do you care? You're never going to sell John Grisham in any quantity. Why don't you find an author that nobody knows? For example, Nevada Barr. And you could sell a lot of Nevada Barr as opposed to maybe 4 John Grisham. And they all looked at me, and then one of them said to me, I've never forgotten this. He said, but we'd have to read Nevada Barr to sell Nevada Barr. In other words, it was easier to sell Grisham because everybody had already done the work than it was. And I also wonder, thinking about it now, whether that was also a way of sort of saying they didn't have enough confidence in their own judgment to stand up and tell people to read Nevada Barr, that it would be easier to push the Grisham. I mean, it's what's going on right now with the Barack Obama memoir. We actually had a bookstore here who said they could survive this year if they could sell 1,000 copies of the Obama memoir. Well, do the math. $35,000 44% less whatever, going to net maybe 16,000. I'm really good at numbers, 15,000, something like that. If you can run a bookstore on $15,000 or $16,000, good luck to you. So my point is that that new writers and all should focus on the fact that they would be different, they would be fun, they would be unexpected, and they might grow up to be more successful writers.
Sure. And
So it's
to
an investment.
Sure. And to sort of piggyback on that, talking about newer writers or writers who might not be as seasoned and who don't do as many events, do you have any words of advice or guidance about how they can go about making connections with their local booksellers, particularly maybe before they have a book out so that there's already an established relationship before they have something to promote? Is there anything that you would say to them to get them involved in that community?
Well, one thing they could do would be to attend some virtual events by the bookstore they have in mind to see how that operates, because everybody does them differently. If they have a publisher, it's easier for a bookstore, a bookseller, to deal with a publicist and either say yes or no than it is to deal with an author directly. It's
Right.
very hard, to say no. And I get probably 12 emails a day from authors that would like us to do something. And they clearly have really no idea what they're asking or how to go about it. It's So the other advice I would give is try to learn the basics of publishing. If you are self-published, most bookstores are not going to be able to afford you. And your real audience, your real bookseller is Amazon. It just is. Unless you've got some local connection, that might work out very well. If you have a small publisher, your small publisher should still be able to make a connection with the bookstore. And they need to send out basic information. If I get a query and it has no information about the price or the publication date or the basic ISBN of 13 digits or whatever, I'm going to have to go to a certain amount of work in order to even find the book. If all I have is text, if that's all they have said. It's astonishing how many publishers, I really chewed out Hachette because they were sending out emails promoting books and they didn't bother to put the ISBN in. And I said, if I have to take the extra step, I'm probably just going to click through your email. Hello?
Sure.
So, you need to be professional. You need to present your book with all the relevant information that is going to help the bookstore sell it. Then you have to have your little pitch. And, if you go directly, don't be offended if the store can't accommodate you. We are seeing an example of real incivility playing out right in front of us every day. And I think that civility is one of the oils that really makes the machine go around. And we get to pick and choose. And so if I have somebody rude or somebody uncivil, or hasn't done their homework, why would I take some of our resources and direct them in that way? So I think no matter who you are, you can be professional.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you too, because I know that this question is going to apply to your store, but I think a lot of independent bookstores in general have become very resourceful and have a lot of services that readers might not be aware of. So in addition to the virtual events that we've talked about, can you talk about some of the things that your bookstore and other independent bookstores are able to offer that you can't find on Amazon, you're not going to find in a big book box store? So podcasts, book clubs, things of that nature that are other ways to get readers engaged.
Sure, we do all of that. I have written to our customers every single month since November of 1989. We started out with a printed form and people would send back checks. We had a fax machine program with international numbers. So we graduated to the internet. We've graduated to credit cards and PayPal, whatever. I'm really shocked when I see a bookstore who, I read one the other day, is something about a bookstore was really worried about its holiday season because they hadn't gotten around to preparing their holiday catalog. And I think you can't run a bookstore on a once a year holiday catalog. So one thing that an aspiring author could do would be to send a review, the pitch, as I mentioned to you, which makes life easier for the store. We do book clubs, and virtual events have meant that they are no longer geographically bound. Um, so that we have now people attending our book clubs who live all over the country. I have done an amazing number of Zoom events with authors I'm doing one Saturday, in fact, with the Detection Club from the UK. We have been to Sweden, we have been to Iceland, we have been all over England and Ireland, Australia, New Zealand. I love that. I've actually put together programs with authors living in, different sides of the world. The hardest part's time zones. People cannot work out time zones. It's just amazing. Um, so again, if you can create sort of theater, I mean, a really good Zoom event is theater, let's face it. Patrick, who does them with me, because this is another thing. If you're doing the interview, you should not be doing the tech. It is, and especially if you have comments, it's totally distracting, and then you lose focus on the author and the interview. But Patrick said he feels as though he's some Hollywood producer over there, queuing in and doing all this other stuff. So book clubs are great. The podcast is something we've recently started, and I've been, as I said, just astonished since June, 50,000 downloads. Who knew? We often do conferences when we could, and I hope we'll go back to them, but we've had a Poison Pen conference every year for many years. When Ian Rankin hit his 30th anniversary, his publisher didn't seem to want to do anything. So Ian wrote to me and he said, what are we going to do for my 30th anniversary? So I put together a whole conference at the Arizona Biltmore. We had 150 people. Ian flew in from Scotland. We had a great time. So you can do these personal connections that are astonishing. I think that authors need to do the basics. They need to have a website. They need to have, if possible, some other way to communicate. It could be Twitter, it could be social media. We do really huge events. We're in the middle of a 4,000 book event, and we're coming up on a 3,000 book event for January. Neither of those is driven entirely by our customer base. We have about 25,000 people that I write to 2 or 3 times a week. But those kinds of sales do not arise entirely from us. They arise from those authors whom I've trained to put in the Poison Pen as the one place where you can actually get an autographed book or you can attend an event or something. And so if every author needs to assemble a toolkit. It's, essential. You can lose yourself on social media. So you might want to just pick one and do it well, or eventually authors with more money hire people to do, their social media and so forth. I don't care whether it's Facebook or Twitter, whatever, but that's really important. And a bookstore would probably expect the author to support whatever the bookstore is doing with the author's social media as well. And it takes them together, plus whatever the publisher wants to throw in, because publishers also have social media. And so if you put them all together like a trifecta, you can get some really great results. And again, a small publisher, somebody, can do a wonderful job. They have more focus. They care more than Random House. Let's face it, they just do. Right now, all of Random House's resources are going to Barack Obama. So, what a great time for Blackstone to be talking to me.
Right, absolutely. And we have a couple minutes left, so I have maybe 1 or 2 more questions for you, and I noted a couple in that chat box that you were referring to. But I did want to ask you, it is the holiday season and people are starting to think about doing their shopping. Maybe they are doing their shopping. So what do you want people to know about why their patronage of independent bookstores, whether it's in store or online, is important? Why does it matter in supporting their local community?
Well, it helps the whole community continue to prosper. Short storefronts don't shutter. It engages people. One of the reasons we're the bookstore we are is that when we started in Scottsdale, there was no local community. Scottsdale is a tourist destination. Nobody lived here. So that's why we became this long distance, I write to you, we'll do it all kind of bookstore. But that's atypical. Every bookstore should really reflect its own community. And it's important to support it because it's part of the personality, part of the attraction. We have people who've moved to Scottsdale because we are here. We had, there's a wonderful couple moved here from Las Cruces, New Mexico, because they got tired of commuting 2 or 3 times a week. And so it's surprising the kind of anchor you do. You also keep money in your community, which can be used for other community services. And you also don't want the whole book industry to be dictated by 1 or 2 giant retailers. You don't want everything they do to have to go through Barnes and Noble for an okay. You don't want everything to have to be sold through Amazon. I mean, I get along really well with Barnes and Noble, and Amazon's never bothered us one way or another because they don't do any of the things we do.
Right.
But that takes customers being educated and understanding how important it is. We had a lovely man the other day who sent us a query, and he said, I can't buy books from you because I have to read on an e-reader because I have an eye problem. But he said, I've loved your events and I want to support your store and I'd like to make a donation. How can I do that? And we wrote him back and we thanked him and we said, you know, send it by PayPal. And I think we're going to put a tip jar on our podcast page because, you know, we know there are people there who are enjoying them, but they're not contributing anything towards the cost of doing it. And none of it's for free. So I think it's important to say to people, you know, it's not good enough just to attend it. You're not a customer if all you do is show up and watch a video. You
Right.
are only a customer if you actually spend money.
Right. And that's why I love when my Marcia Clark book comes and it's flat signed and it's got the protective plastic wrapping. I mean, it is an experience to unbox that book. About 7:30, so I have to let you go in a moment, but I did have one last question. And this comes from the comments. Somebody wanted to know approximately how many books you read in a week. Has that changed during the pandemic? And do you have any Lori R. King stories?
I have a load of Lori R. King stories, and I will say right now that Lori R. King on December 3rd and with Leslie Klinger will be joining me, so you can watch her do that. And Dana Stabenow lives in my house every winter, so she's here for 3 months, and she and Lori and I are friends, so maybe Dana will join in. I'm sorry, what was the first part of it?
So somebody wanted to know how many
Oh,
books you read in a
I
week and has your
still,
relationship changed in the pandemic?
the only reason that I am not reading roughly 100 books a week, and then that is some of that's book triage, because you know to actually read them all the way through. I'm a speed reader is my one real skill, and I can read 5 books on an ordinary day without breaking a sweat. But I've also learned that if you read 20 or 30 pages, you can figure it out. And frankly, with this wave of domestic suspense where the whole thing is going to be the end, I read just enough to see the setup and then I skim the entire middle in order to get to the end for the payoff because it's not my favorite genre anyway. But the problem with the pandemic has been that have not been advanced reading copies. And
Right.
so I have been forced to quote other reviewers in my newsletters, and it's lost a lot of its personality. And so I can't read digitally because I can't remember anything because I'm old and, you know, I don't read that way. So fortunately, publishers have finally figured this all out, and now they just send me PDFs. I probably could have retired when I got the John Grisham PDF in September if I just put it up for auction. Could have just, you know, sold the Grisham PDF and said to my staff, take the money, divide it up, we're done here. And I appreciate that vote of confidence from publishers because we are completely trustworthy. I would never actually do that. It was just a fun thought. So that's been my problem, is that I haven't got enough to read.
Sure. No. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. Really appreciate your time. I know you have an event to scoot off to, and maybe after people finish up with CrimeCon here, they'll come to the Poison Pen and check you out a little bit later tonight. But thank you so much for being here.
You're entirely welcome. It's a brand new author tonight, Nev Marchant, who won the Minotaur Best First Mystery novel, and I inveigled Sujata Messi into joining us to sell it. But and it's really important that people attend. I say that all the time to our customers. It's the more important that you attend a debut novel event than any other event. Better to come tonight than to have gone to see Michael on Tuesday. Michael doesn't need you anymore.
That's right. You heard her, people. Show up. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. It was a real
Welcome. Thank you all very much for having me. Good night.
pleasure. Good night. And now we are going to turn it over to Mr. Charles Salzberg.
Thanks, John. Hi, Lauren. I'm not going to, we only have like a half hour, so I'm not going to waste time with your bio because I'm assuming that everyone either read the promo or the Google, or Googled you. So I want to start with, I hope you or no one else takes this the wrong way, but you kept me up 8 or 9 nights straight because I got hooked on your podcast, your true crime podcast, A Murder in Oregon. And actually, I'd never listened to a crime podcast, no podcast at all, actually, until the pandemic. And then I was, writers are made for the pandemic. Actually, I have been practicing social, quarantining my whole life. But I wanted to start, Lauren, by just how did you get into doing true crime podcasting? How did that come about? And then I want to kind of focus on Murder in Oregon, because what I realized when I started to listen is it's extremely close, the true crime podcast, to writing a novel. I mean, we have chapters and you have episodes. And so tell us a little about Murder in Oregon and how the story came to you.
Excellent. Well, I have to start by saying that I am by nature a recovering television producer. That's what I started in. I actually started in radio, in news. And so podcasting has almost been full circle for me. But I was working in daytime television for years. I was on the same show, the Dr. Oz show, as his special features producer for off and on for 8 years. And during that time, I started doing more and more true crime. There was an insatiable appetite for that content, but our show always came at it from a mental health and human interest angle. And that really became my expertise. In television, you have a chunk of time off in the summer, a hiatus. And during one of those chunks of time, I was asked to do a podcast with one of the women I had met on the show, a woman named Melissa Moore, whose father, Keith Hunter Jesperson, was known as the Happy Face Killer. I had never, like you, listened to a podcast before. And that was actually a blessing because I had no idea what I was trying to create. I'm a storyteller by nature, and having been in television for so long, I had really been limited into telling stories in a minute and 30 seconds or reducing people's entire experience into short little palatable sound bites. So it was an incredibly liberating medium for me to actually let people tell their story and interweave their sound bites. And because I'm a television producer, I wanted to tell an audio story in a very, very visual way. And that's, I guess, what I've become known for doing in the space. But I'm first and foremost a storyteller who likes to listen to people talk.
And how did you tell the people a little about what Murder in Oregon is about, and how did the story come to you?
So while I was working on Happy Face, which is the story of Melissa Jesperson Moore coming to terms with the fact that she found out her father was a serial killer and, serial rapist at the age of 15. The reporter who was working for the Oregonian, Phil Stanford, who is a wonderful crime writer and a seasoned crime reporter, was the guy who gave Jesperson the moniker, the Happy Face Killer, because Jesperson used to send tormenting letters to the Oregonian, to Phil Stanford, and he'd sign them with a happy face. If you do get the chance to read his series on the Happy Face Killer, it's some of the best crime um, writing you'll find. But while I pulled Stanford, who, like you, is very, very comfortable being off the grid, he has moved now, but he lived on the coast in Oregon, as far away from everybody as he could be. And I just talked him into being on the podcast because I so desperately wanted to hear his take on Jesperson. But the whole time, and he agreed, kicking and screaming, he kept saying, I don't know why you're interested in that story. This is the story you should be telling. And it was the story of Michael Franke. And that had become Phil Stanford's personal obsession, to the point it derailed his career at the Oregonian because he kept beating the drum for justice in the face of corruption, which also stemmed the paper at the time. But it became a personal obsession, or as Phil would tell you, he was just stubborn. But that's how I became obsessed with the story myself.
Mhm. Now, Jeff, for people who don't know, Michael Franke, I'm going to tell a really quick version of this, and you can correct me.
Sure.
He was hired to work in the prison system in Oregon, a fairly high position, and there was a lot of corruption in the prison system. And he investigated, and he came up with a lot of information that was at the very least embarrassing to people, but of criminal behavior. And then before he could give out the report, he was murdered. He was knifed to death, if I remember correctly, Lauren, and it was right where he worked. It was right outside the building where he worked. And that became, that's pretty much the story, the basis for the story of who did this, who committed this crime, right? So I wondered, Lauren, first of all, how much, before you get that first episode, how much research did you do?
It took probably 6 months before I could really wrap my head around all of the players, all of the events, because it was very interwoven. And yes, when the night of the murder plays out like a movie scene because it's stranger than fiction. He
Mhm.
was the director of the Department of Corrections for Oregon. He was brought in to clean up his department. He uncovered, as you mentioned, widespread corruption. And the night before he was to deliver the findings of his investigation to a legislative committee on the topic, he is stabbed through the heart and found on the front steps of the building that he walked. And it's just dismissed as a random car burglary gone bad. And at the time, the prisons in Oregon were so overcrowding that any car burglar would know it would be the equivalent of getting a car, a ticket. You'd be in and out of prison in no time if you even went. And who would target the car that's clearly marked with a parking sign, Director of Corrections? Not my first place to look if I was looking to scrounge some change out of a random car. So right from there, you have a feeling that something's amiss, something is wrong. And that's what kind of caught Phil Stanford's attention. Also, there were other things that were just red flags about that night. If it was a robbery and they stabbed him in the heart, why didn't they take his wallet?
Mhm.
Why didn't they take his watch? Um,
Or
Nothing
his
was
car.
disturbed.
Or his car. The car
Yeah,
was.
nothing was disturbed in the car. But what was missing was his briefcase, and in it, the floppy disks, which would have probably contained a lot of information that we can infer that many people would not want released.
What's interesting now that we know about your TV career is television and movies, you have images that you can rely on. And occasionally you can use narration, or if it's a dramatic program, you can act it out. But you don't have that. It's just your voice. When you're, as I was, sitting there or lying there in the dark, it's you and me and whoever else you're getting to tell parts of the story, because that's the other unique thing about podcasting is it's not just your voice. You're interviewing people. His brother was part of Michael Franke's brother was part of it. So was it difficult for you, Lauren, to write the podcast after writing for television, which is much more image oriented?
No, it was wonderful. It was so liberating. As I said, my goal is for you to be able to put on headphones, close your eyes, and see the story. And a big problem in television is attention span. You won't necessarily sit and watch somebody speak for a minute and 20 seconds unless they're covered with generic, what we call B-roll shots in television. So, you would interview a police sergeant and you would hear him talking, but you'd see him walking down the hallway, pulling out a file, looking through the file, taking his keys, going to the car, all of these things just to hold people's attention to what the man's saying. And with podcasting, you don't have that.
Right.
Now, I interweave audio, absolutely. Soundscaping is a huge part of a podcast. And I think it differentiates the quality of a podcast tremendously. I use a lot of music. I also like a lot of nat sound. So when I do go into the field, I'm also getting the sound of gravel crunching underneath. I want to hear the sound of birds. Barbara joked about the dog in the background that didn't bark. I actually want to hear the dog bark at times because that's real life. It's sometimes messy, and I like to incorporate that into the stories I'm trying to tell.
Now, sort of divulge why I actually got in touch with Lauren because I enjoyed the podcast, and the novel I'm working on now has a podcaster character, and Lauren was nice enough to answer all my questions about podcasting behind the scenes. And so I think it's very interesting. So why don't you it's not like you just are working alone, which is what I needed to know, Lauren. Tell who your backup people are, why you need an editor, why you need a producer, whatever else you need. Tell a little about that, what goes into making the podcast, besides you finding the story and writing the story.
I have a wonderful team that I've worked with since my first podcast. Um, Noel Brown, who I've worked with since Happy Face, was the supervising producer on that. And interestingly enough, the team I work with, which is the supervising producer, Taylor Chacoin, Noel, who now executive produces with me, and Tristan McNeil, who is also an editor and a sound engineer, they're all musicians. And so it's very interesting that they really understand how to set a mood. And they are a huge part of helping me present a story that's powerful and impactful beyond just the interviews and the narration. Um, Audio has been a learning hurdle for me because I come from television. And while I am used to shooting video, audio, you can fix anything in post except audio to a certain extent. So I've had to kind of do baptism of fire into dealing with the technology of taping remotely and also in person. So I was lucky enough to have people who helped me through that transition.
One of the unique things about podcasting, true crime podcasting, especially, and I don't know if it happened to you, but it's very organic, and it's almost alive, because a lot of the ones like yours, who are dealing with unsolved crimes, will get tips, we'll get people calling in or writing in, and sometimes, again, I don't know if it happened to you, it moves the story in a different direction. And I wondered if that happened in Oregon. I'm sure it didn't happen in the murders at the White House farm, because you were doing interviews, and that's a 30-year-old case that's been adjudicated. But did that happen with murder in Oregon? Because it's an unsolved case. Were you getting any tips or any input?
Tons.
Talk about that a little, how you deal with it, because again, it might take you, it's not like you've written the whole whatever number of episodes, because you can't, because you don't know what's going to happen halfway through if you get a tip that takes you someplace. So did that happen?
It did. And people will reach out to me on social media, via email. And unfortunately, particularly with Murder in Oregon, because we did talk about sex trafficking, and there was a ring at the time. People reached out to me hoping that I could help them find closure or give them greater insight into um, events that I won't share because they're very, very disturbing. But there is something about audio and podcasting that provides an anonymity that people feel much more safe with revealing um, being victims or having endured crimes. You can protect someone's identity. And so I had a number of people who were willing to speak with me on the record and off record for that podcast who would have been too afraid to come forward had there been a video camera attached to the interview.
Mhm. Because some of the podcasts are more than just telling stories. For instance, there's one called In the Dark,
Mm-hmm,
which dealt with the Curtis Flowers case,
mm-hmm,
which is a famous case. It's about a Black man in Mississippi, I believe, who was accused of murdering 4 or 5 people in a furniture store. And he was arrested, and it appears that he did not do it, but he was tried 6 times, 6 times, twice, 2 mistrials, and 4 of the trials were overturned because the DA, and it was the same DA in all 6 cases, the DA excluded Black people from the jury. And eventually, in the last 6 months, because in large part because of the podcast, his case was taken to the Supreme Court, and they won. And the state of Mississippi decided not to try him again. But those are a little bit different because they're doing a lot of the investigative reporting. Are you interested in doing that part of it too, Lauren? I mean, I don't know what you have next up for you, but that's I don't want to say that it's more active than yours, but it's kind of a different purpose. And then there's David
Well,
Wiggins, who does the another really good one called Someone Knows Something. So talk a little about that. What's up next for you, and what do you hope to do with podcasting?
right now, I'm working on the second season of Murder in Oregon, which is Murder in Illinois. And without getting into too many specifics of the case, it also hinges, as did Murder in Oregon, on a wrongful conviction. Frank Gable was sitting in prison for 30 years for a murder he did not commit. Um, and he still is facing those legal hurdles. He's not out of the woods yet by any means, although he is no longer in prison. And Murder in Illinois is a deep dive into a man who is in prison for the murder of his wife and 3 children. And I'm working with an organization called Investigating Innocence, and a private detective who works and founded that organization to raise questions as to whether or not he received a fair trial.
It sounds really great. There are a couple of questions here that are pretty good questions that I'm going to ask you. One is, tell us about how incorporating music instrumentation helps to set the tone and evoke a response in listeners.
Well, when we did Happy Face, which was the first one, I am completely open to criticism that some people thought that we relied too heavily on music, but I grew up listening to Peter and the Wolf. And because some of the topics were disturbing, to say the least, with Happy Face, we wanted to give the listener an audio cue so you could prepare yourself and know when disturbing things were coming your way. Um, but also, music has such a power to really um, move one's emotions. And I like to incorporate that, but not in a heavy handed way. One of the first things that we do when we go into post production with my podcasts, Noel Brown, who I mentioned before, and Taylor, who are both musicians, will find original music to complement the podcast. One, because I like giving independent artists income and a venue for their talent, but I really find that you have a very intimate and authentic way of merging music with content.
Another question, the good one is, does working with real crime stories stay with you in a negative way? And do you think you live your life with any more caution because of what you've been doing?
Yes, yes, and yes. So it's interesting because you joke that I keep you up at night. I keep myself up at night at times. And I think the strangest compliment I've ever heard was I have a very soothing voice in a disturbing way. But the content does get to you. When I was not as much in podcasting, but when I was in television and I was covering these horrible, violent stories, um, intent is very important to me. And as long as I come at a story with the intention of shining a light on either injustice of it or really doing justice to the human side of the story, I do not like sensationalizing violent crime. That's just a moral compass that I have always had in covering it. But yes, I am disturbed that there are people who are capable of tremendous evil. And that is a frightening thing. But if I understand what drives some of those people, I can only hope that I can protect others from being subjected to it, including myself and my loved ones and my friends and family.
Once I got hooked and started to look around, I was amazed at how many true crime podcasts there are. I'm not just talking dozens. I'm talking hundreds. Just so many of them. They're obviously popular. What do you think it is that that strikes the public about these? Because it's obviously something.
You know, it's interesting. I think to a certain extent, it's rubbernecking. To a certain extent, it's a wonderful distraction from a lot of the real life things that we're all subjected to. And I guess on some level, we can think that we are at least not being subjected to the horror of the crimes that are covered in some of these podcasts. I also think that there is something about people liking extremes of emotion. When you look at what's really resonating in terms of podcasts, for the most part, people like to laugh or they like to be scared. You know, I think there's something about those two extremes. Um, I I think that it is a little bit of rubbernecking and distraction when it comes to crime.
And tell us, what are the pitfalls that you've come across or what's the most difficult part of putting together a podcast?
I think that I have always said when I've sat down with somebody for an interview that I will be fair and I want them to be as comfortable with the decision of sitting down with me as I am sitting down with them. Um, I take a tremendous amount of responsibility about doing justice to a person's story, particularly when you're dealing with the victims of violent crimes and their families. I have such a sincere respect for their feelings and for their experience and their story. And that comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. Um, so I've lost track of the question, but
You pretty much answered it. So you know, the other interesting thing about it for me is as a writer, I just sit down at the computer and start typing. It's me and the screen. But there are so many moving parts with a podcast. You've named some of them, but the fact that, as I said, that it's kind of most of them or many of them are organic because you can get feedback during it. How do you juggle all those things, Lauren? And how long? Well, how long did Murder in Argonne take from the time you thought this is the story I'm going to do till you finished the last episode? How long are we talking about?
so As I said, I had a little bit of a head start because I had already met Phil Stanford.
Right.
And, I joke in the podcast that Phil and is the only person I call more than my mother. And that was very much true during production because I had so many questions. And he had kept at one point, I think he had 70 boxes of files from over the years. So he had easy access to anything. So that was a tremendous head start. But I would
It's a head
say,
start, but it's also a hindrance. You can have too much information, and to have to go through all that information takes time. So
and, and then there's the internet. Then there are message boards, particularly when you're dealing with cold cases and cases that already have conspiracy theories revolving around them. You can go down the rabbit's hole. But I started in March, really tried to focus and move ahead, went out to Oregon a couple of times, and then the first episode aired in October. So it was a good amount of time that we were in production and post-production.
mm. Well, thank you. I see we're pretty much out of time, although I wanted to ask one more question because I was curious. Some of the podcasts do have advertising, but for the most part, Lauren, are they money losing propositions, or can one make money doing podcasting?
I think that it's interesting. There are people who've monetized it by partnering with big corporate entities. I have done all of the podcasts that I've done with iHeart. I have friends who have done a wonderful job of self-publishing and doing it independently as well. So I don't think that people have figured out how to consistently monetize it
But I thought,
yet, but it's either, selling
well,
commercials or
Um,
marketing.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I mean, I have a ton of other questions, but we're out of time. And I really appreciate you taking your time to do this. It was really fascinating, at least for me, it was. And thanks again for helping me with my book, too.
Oh, please. It was an honor and a pleasure. And this is particularly wonderful because I grew up in Pound Ridge,
Oh,
which
cool.
is a stone's throw away from the library.
Right.
So,
Well, thank you so much. All right. Good night.
good night.
Well, Charles, nicely done. And Lauren, too. I'd like to thank John Valeri and Charles Salzberg for co-moderating tonight's panel. And a special thanks to their stellar guests, one of the greatest voices you'll hear tonight, Lauren Bright Pacheco and Barbara Peters. I never get tired of thanking the Ferguson Library in Stamford, Connecticut for its ongoing support, plus the Mystery Writers of America New York, Connecticut chapter for putting this on. And now a preview of coming attractions 1 week from tonight, Thursday, November 19th, an exciting event. It's Chris Knopf in conversation with the legendary Walter Mosley and breakout author S.A. Cosby. As I always like to say, to miss it would be murder. Good night.